for being here. I'm especially thankful to Professor Michel Danino for having invited me to give these two talks today and tomorrow. And they're really actually one talk, really speaking, the first half of which is the landscape and the second half of which is architecture. So my training has been in design, and I've been teaching, I've taught for many years in the Department of Landscape Architecture. So my perspective is really that of one who looks for forms and patterns in the environment. But as Michelle said, I draw a lot from religious studies, especially when sacred sites and their planning is involved. Yes. And geography. From anthropology and social sciences, come methods such as rapid ethnographic assessment in order to make sense of the culture or the subculture of the place we are studying, and a little bit of art history. Because if you work on India, you really cannot avoid looking at how art and architecture kind of fuse together in creating the built environment. So today I'm going to talk about Mandal. And the Mandal, as it is in the West, Mandala, has become a very, very popular concept in the last few decades. Maybe I think it went back to the time of Beatles, or maybe even before that. I don't know, the coming of many Swamis to North America. And it is a term that seems to capture everything that you want to think about as associated with sacredness, rejuvenation, therapy, and so on and so forth. Now, I want you to take a moment and think about how this word is in your own conversation ever. We kind of, I think, take it for granted in South Asia, but it does enter the languages, even the modern languages. And so I'd like to ask you, when was the last time you actually came across a mandal or drew one or used the word in some other context? I think we use the word mandal also for assembly. So there are many sabha mandals, mandai. I was recently in Pune and I saw mandai, mandali. So mandal could mean assembly. It could mean, it has temporal connotations. It is spatial, spatio-temporal. It's an idea that has got, it's got a lot of wide-ranging associations with different aspects of religious life for sure, but also I think secular life or social life, let's say. Really, basically, the mandal, I think, if you really kind of think about its essential meaning, it boils down to being a circle. That's all there is to it. A mandal is a circle. So, a mandal of people sitting in a circle. The Saur Mandal, the solar system, the Bhu Mandal, the conception of the world as a great round. So here in this image, you see a few patterns, and they range from tree to leaf-like, flowers, all different kinds of pattern. But what they do have in common is a circular form. So think about the circle, and what does it mean, really? What are the psychological associations of a circle? I would, yeah? Alone, did you say? Halo, okay. A halo, halo behind, yeah, a deity. Yes? A cycle, yes. A cycle of time, a cycle of life. A Symmetry, yes. Perfect symmetry, a perfect circle. Okay. Infinity, yes, yes, infinity. Everything loops back to itself. It's an endless loop. um, may I say the circle also implies unity, a completeness. So to draw a circle is saying something, It's implying unity of kind, in a group of people, camaraderie, in drawing the circle as a symbol of the world. Again, the association is that of completion and unity. So today what I'm going to cover is how the mandal is a symbol of the universe, cosmos, and it becomes a microcosm, a metaphor, a symbol of the cosmos, and how the diagram of the mandal is a kind of an archetype, kind of an earth form. We know that in Tibetan Buddhism, mandals are very much used as aids to meditation and concentration. Today I'm also interested in squaring the circle or circling the square, not as a mathematical problem, and Professor Denino has a lot to say about it, but how the circle and the square or quaternity are symbols of the whole, of totality. A circle does not indicate direction, but the world in which we live in, there are cardinal directions, and so to bring the circle here in this world, I think quaternity has to be incorporated. Mimi Lobel, who has written a very interesting book on spatial archetypes, it was just published, I think, a couple of years ago by Shambhala Press, talks about epochs as having their own symbols. And she says that the circle or the great round was a symbol of those societies in which the feminine principle was venerated. Okay. Now you'll ask me, what exactly does the feminine principle mean? And there's a little bit of Jungian thinking here. Feminine principle is, we carry, in Jungian thinking, we carry both the anima and animus in our psyche, and the feminine principle simply celebrates all that we associate with being female, and that is, nurturance and egalitarianism. So societies before the coming of the Bronze Age, the Bronze Age is equated with the birth of the ego and the hero. The societies, and I suspect that even in the subcontinent, earlier societies such as that of Indus-Saraswati civilizations venerated the feminine principle. But then we see the dominance of square as cities came to be built and as monuments came to be built. And so today and tomorrow, I'll talk about how the circle in the landscape is its energies are distilled in the square and rectangular forms of the cities and buildings. So some common words that I think are very interesting and give us an idea about how places came to be made. Terms like kshetra and tirtha and dham and peeth. as Diana Eck describes in A Sacred Geography, India is a network of sacred sites. And she says the very idea of India is actually connected with, with the presence of sacrality in the landscape. And the idea of India is continuously reaffirmed in the movement of people in the pilgrimage as they go from one dham to another dham, from one tirth to another tirth. So the word kshetra means a region. I'm teaching a class called Landscapes. Some of you are here, I think, yeah. And I asked my students, what is equivalent to landscape in Indian languages? And they looked up the dictionary and they said it is to do with view, right? That is the dictionary definition. What exactly was it? What was the word they used? Paridrashya. I don't think it's a word in common language. So here, I think what the dictionaries are doing is they're borrowing a definition of landscape from other languages, from English primarily, but other languages of Europe also, whether it has to do with Champagne or French language, they really are about views. And I think in Indic cultures and Indic languages, landscape was never really just a view, even though some of the most spectacular landscapes can be seen in this region, in this part of the world. So I find the word like kshetra, for instance, much more evocative of what landscape means in the Indic context. And kshetra is simply just a region. A tirtha is a crossing, a ford. So when you are in Prayag Tirtha, you have the possibility of crossing over to. If you are on Varanasi, on the banks of the Ganga, again you have the chance of either releasing from all the the worldly associations, but also that these are places to die and places to unite with the divine. Dham is residence of gods, and similarly, Peet is where the goddess is. So we just see, the number of centers that there are, 51 Shakti Peet, 12 Jyotirlinga, and I think there are many, many more. Hundreds of tirthas across the country. So what is going on here? Now, in ancient India, whatever that may mean, however back it goes, ancient India goes, the idea of founding a place was very much tied up with the presence of divine. So that was a real place. Okay. So today, when we try to talk about places, we distinguish between space and place. So space is like continuum, and we make a place, we make a dwelling, we make the space a place by attaching meaning to it. Okay. So a place is, your dwelling, your birthplace. A place is where you would have gone and toured, and spend some, a good time. A place is where something meaningful has happened. A place is not something which is anonymous and neutral, but it's got associations, your own personal associations. And I think this is what the ancients were doing. They were making places, but what was real to them was the presence of the divine. That's what made the place real. And in Mircea Eliade's terms, it was this eruption of the divine in the continuum of profane space, that which was characterless. It was this eruption of the divine, or the revelation of the divine, a sight of hierophany that made the place really what it is, charged with meaning. And that's where you would want to live, right? I like this word archetype a lot, and because I find that it doesn't really tie you down to anything very specific form or meaning. Although there are many, there are some forms and there are meanings, and these meanings are very profound. But an archetype is much more powerful concept than, say, a mere classification of phenomena. So the Indian subcontinent is an interesting landscape. What makes it interesting? Of course, it's a peninsula, very long coastline, and the Great Plains of North, peninsular India tapering to a tip, and then the hills and the Himalaya. So I imagine that the ancients really saw it as an entity, like an island, and surrounded by ocean on all sides. So to them, an island form was a kind of a form that they repeated again and again. It signified, the birth of land from the cosmic waters. So there are many natural archetypes in the subcontinent that evoke awe and wonder. Okay. And these were duplicated in formal design terms, which are spatial archetypes. And these became centers or axes connecting the different realms together. Now, if the sacred space is so charged with meaning, then it has to be distinguished from what is around it. And it has a periphery, and that periphery has to be protected. Not only does it have to be protected by the presence of gods, but it also has to be continuously reaffirmed in movement. And have you ever wondered why you go around when something, when you're in a temple, for sure you will go around, right? The main sanctuary. And the word circumambulation, going around and coming back to the same point, what does this ritual what does it mean? This movement is not just, if the meaning is lost to us, we still do it. It must have meant something. Any takers? Why do you circumambulate? Why do you do parikrama or pradikshina, that is going south? Okay, so like Ganesh, going around Kata, Parvati, you have also gone around the whole world and... okay. Yes, I think that is exactly what the idea is. But in a way, you're also affirming that you're going around something sacred, whether it is the deity or it is a tree, a sacred tree like the Buddhists go around the Bodhi tree. So what I want to talk about today, and I know this is a long introduction, but I wanted this to be a preamble to some of the landscapes that I'm going to show today, which I think are very good examples of mandals. So these examples of landscape take us to a definition of a landscape, not just merely as a view, a scenic view, but they take us to a definition of landscape as an image. And in this case, the image of the great round or the circle. They take us to the definition of landscape as place, actual finding a place and holding on to it. Okay. And this place has a certain vocabulary, a certain language that it has evolved over time. And this place, this landscape is about an event. And that's why I say the mandal is a spatio-temporal entity. It's an event. An event is something that starts at a point in time, right? And it involves, people. It involves, it's an episode. And I'm going to tell you that a landscape is an event. Okay, it's an happening. Okay, so we are familiar with these Thangka paintings. And certainly this has made, at least in the West, the idea of having a miniature cosmos very popular. So many museums, have this mandal made in sand by Tibetan monks. Also, sometimes you see yantras, and I'm curious if you use mandal and yantra interchangeably, or you think of them as two distinct entities. Are they one and the same? So, yantras, yeah? Jyotika, you had? So often in a pilgrimage site, you'll see the Sri Chakra yantra, triangles facing, triangles meeting at a certain point, and those triangles represent, Prakriti and Purush, and that is, the meeting point is the bindu, and that's the gestation of the universe. Yantra simply means, a machine, any device. But yantra and mandals are both used, as I said, aids for concentration and meditation. I think what before Tibetan monks did their sand paintings, and before the Thangkas became popular, Carl Jung, this psychologist, a Swiss psychologist, who was very interested in alchemy, began to write about mandalas, and he says that in his own quest for wholeness and that of his patients, many of whom suffered from mental problems, they drew figures like these circles, quaternary, and what these representations were aiming was, again, wholeness. The fractured psyche could be put together, could be made whole, and that is what it's striving for with the aid of the psychologist, the psychoanalyst, or a spiritual healer, or a guru. Okay, so we haven't quite heard or seen the last of Diana Eck, and here is a quote from her book, A Sacred Geography, which I urge all of you to read. I know you've read chapters for this course, but it's really quite a remarkable book. And she says, anywhere one goes in India, one finds a living landscape in which mountains, rivers, forests, and villages are elaborately linked to the stories of gods and heroes. The land bears the traces of the gods and footprints of the heroes. Every place has its story, and conversely, every story is in the vast storehouse of myth and legend has its place. So this is a landscape of memory. I'm not going to talk about mandals in the class, but this is really a, this landscape, a sacred landscape, is a landscape of memory, and remember them through the stories of gods and heroes. Okay, so I'm not going to take you through as I said, hundreds of tirthas and the sacred places of the subcontinent, which Diana Eck covers very well. But what I'm going to show you are a few places which I have become very familiar with in my repeated, going there with not in search of salvation, spiritual salvation, but more to understand the language of the place, to see how these places represent what we think of as the past encoded, embodied in the site. These are places for sure. I mean, these are iconic places. These are places that you will remember always if you have been there even once. And these are places which have a very strong imagery associated with them. So Varanasi, for instance, we associate it with the Ganga, right? And it is visually a very powerful landscape. So there's Ganga, there's a forest of shivlings, and there are other deities in the hundreds of shrines, some of which underground. So it's an iconographic landscape, a landscape of imagery. But how was Varanasi founded? How did Varanasi come to be? And Diana Eck, of course, has written a very powerful book on the City of Light, published way back in 1982. And she, I think, has really made Varanasi studies very popular. What's the origin of Varanasi? And how does it represent the knowledge of ancient India? You'd say, it's a place full of colleges, Sanskrit colleges, universities, and so on and so forth. But that's not what I'm not talking about Sanskrit studies here, and I'm not talking about the rituals, etc. I'm talking about the founding of a place in the Indo-Gangetic plain. So here we see a 6th century fragment, and we see the linga of light, Jyotirlinga. Okay, and this linga is, we don't know the top, we don't know where it's going down to. So Brahma becomes a goose and flies to the top. Vishnu becomes a boar and goes down to find the base, but neither of them can find it. Okay. So Varanasi or Kashi is a pillar of light. It's an axis mundi. It's a center. It is the site of hierophany. Okay. This is where Shiva resides. And interestingly enough, Shiva was not the original inhabitant of the place. All right. There were other gods and goddesses. And these were matrikas, and these were ganas, and these were gram devtas, village gods and goddesses. So Shiva becomes the ruler of Varanasi, and I guess there was, the myth has it that Devadasa, the Buddhist ruler, had to make way for Shiva. And so Kashi, where Shiva always resides, now is the center. But it's also a mandal. It's a Kashi mandal. And as I said, the mandal has both a center and periphery, because the sacred has to be distinguished from the ordinary. The sacred, mind you, is the holy, and it has got, both the dark side and the light side, both life and death. But it has to be distinguished from the continuum of space which has got no character, the profane space. So there's got to be a periphery. And what is this periphery made of, So I imagine ancient Varanasi, which was really actually a small settlement at the intersection of River Varuna and Ganga. I don't imagine Varanasi to be the circle with a fortified settlement with walls. So this circle really is a circle which is imagined. It's in the head. And it's a circle, again, representing totality and wholeness. Okay, because Hinduism is really based on this idea of unity, of the one, and then the Atma trying to be one with the Paramatma. So here we have a circle. You see two circles here. One is called the Panch Kroshi Parikrama Mark, and the other one, the larger one, is called the Chorasi Kosh Parikrama. But if you follow the pilgrims, they are, of course, coming back to where they had started their journey, which was at Manikarnika Ghat, not too far away from the center of Kashi, that is the Vishwanath temple. So they take a bath in Manikarnika Kund, worship Dhundiraja, Lord Ganesh, and then start walking. And then they come back to the temple. They started with Sankalp Lena and Sankalp Chorna. But they're not actually, if you trace their movement, it's not a circle. It's like a segment of the circle. And when you map it, this is what it appears like. So a German architect collected all the maps of Varanasi, and he made his own maps. And he alerted us to the fact that there are actually many circles, and they're in Kashi, and they're imagined circles. And more on that later. I would like to come back to the point of the mandal being a spatio-temporal entity. So the parikrama is done at a certain time, usually Ekadashi or Purnimasi, and it is also, done other seasons. But what is interesting in Chaitra Mas and in the Vasant and so on, Ashar, but what's most interesting is that every so few years, there is a time period called the Adikmas, okay? And in Adikmas, what happens, that's an extra month. When you try to bring the solar and lunar calendars together, you get an extra month. And that is supposed to be a polluted month, okay? And the pilgrimage during that time period is supposed to be most fulfilling, wish fulfilling, and most meritorious. So what is going on here is that I think in this act of circumambulation, pilgrims are ridding themselves of their own sins, moral sins, and becoming purified. And they are doing so by taking baths, literally, in the water bodies on the periphery. So both the individual as well as cosmic time is being rid of pollution, and space is being rid of pollution also. Do you follow what I'm saying? So I come back to the concept of sacredness. Sacredness, literally, what is meaningful, that which is charged with energy. But in the Hindu context, Indic context, it also means a pure place, a place purified by the penance of sages. So all around, on the periphery, where there were shrines of the Ganas and Matrikas, we see sages coming and establishing their ashrams. And they are saying, okay, this is Tapovan, okay, this is a forest of penance, and they're purifying the place, and they're making it, again, a sacred kshetra by that act of penance. So here we have, on the left, we have a pilgrimage map, and on the right, we have the city of Banaras when it was first mapped by James Prinsep in 1822. Now, pilgrimage has been going on for 700 years or probably more, and it really picked up in the 19th century. And so there were pilgrim maps were drawn to lead the pilgrim to all the sacred sites they have to visit in the course of their pilgrimage. So in this pilgrim map of 19th century called Kashi Darpan, meaning the mirror of Kashi, what do you see? And contrast it with the map drawn by Prinsep. What's the difference you see here? So the one on your right is a conventional map, right? It shows the streets of Varanasi, the labyrinthine streets. It shows Ganga. It shows the center, the Kashi Vishwanath temple. And James Prinsep actually does trace the Parikrama Marg. But this map is a depiction of what Prinsep saw, and what we are, by habit now, by convention, are taught to see the world. That's how we see, right? But Kailash Nath Sukul is not seeing the world in that way. He's not seeing Kashi Kshetra in that way. He's seeing it as a circle. And he's seeing a square inside the circle. Did you notice that? So there are many places, but the places are marked in the form of words, right? And icons, like little edicule. So it's like a kind of a word map. Ganga is not on below, but it's above, or not on the west. And so Varanasi is the city, is the square, a quadrilateral, and it's embedded in Kashi Kshetra, which is the mandal. And it is a mandal because it has been made sacred by the presence of Shiva, by the presence of other deities, got incorporated in the Shaivite pantheon, by the penance of sages, and its sacredness is continuously being affirmed by worship. The movement of pilgrims as they go clockwise around the mandal. So this is the work of my student Saloni Chawla at University of Illinois. She decided to do a thesis, and she got very interested, in the landscape of the parikrama, which is like a band. And so she actually is mapping, and she finds that there is every place. There are about 108 places, but there are actually 5 places which pilgrims stop overnight. And in every place, usually there is a water body. Most places have a water body. And it's very likely, and the water body has a shrine, and it's very likely that this water body and shrine were located in a grove. So in the past, and as recently as middle of 18th century, we know that Varanasi was not built up, and it was a very, very, it had a lot of pools and water bodies, and it was kind of a natural landscape. But this, I believe, is the unit. The talab, which is a natural water body, the kund, which is a tank, the shrine, and these kind of commemorate, celebrate the place. And a constellation of them, marks the periphery of the mandal. Yes, and purify yourself, yes, by bathing. So you are, you are getting rid of the sin by getting rid of their sins by the mere act of going on a pilgrimage. But then there is a physical act also of cleansing yourself. So pilgrims usually walk at night, and they start very early, maybe 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. They take the bath and then they start walking because the sun gets very hot, and then they will reach to the next place and they sleep for a few hours, sing bhajans or whatever, worship in the shrine, and then start again. So these are the 5 places, and these places, Kardameshwar, named after the sage Kardam, Kapildhara, named after the sage Kapil, the founder of Sankhya philosophy, Rameshwar, where, the Rameshwar in the south is duplicated here because Ram had come here as well, Ram and Sita had come here as well. Bhimchandi, the fierce goddess, Shivpur, the 5 Pandav brothers had come and they had established their coop, just as we saw in Dwarka. So I'm going to go a little quickly because I think you see what is going on here in Kashi Mandal, and Gandharv Sagar in Bhimchandi, which is quite a big water body. And I will just very quickly show you the satellite images of the 5 vasthans where they spend the night. And you see that the talav or the kund is the central feature, and then there'll be a larger macro catchment that feeds the talav. And what is marked in orange are the shrines, what is marked in red are the dharamshalas, which are always on the profane side. So as you're walking clockwise, they'll be on your right, on your left side. We did not find, Saloni and I interviewed pilgrims, and we didn't find anybody who would explain to us, okay, we are walking because this is what we will make the mandal, They said, because this is what we have always done, since generations. I want to get moksha, or my wishes have been granted. Okay, so I'm going to take you to 2 more or 3 more sites, if time allows. The Braj Mandal is another very popular mandal and held in very high regard by devotees and pilgrims. And this pilgrimage takes a much longer time. It takes more than a month. So what is happening over here, and how is Braj conceived as? It's actually, they talk about the Braj as a lotus, not exactly as a circle, but as a lotus. And in this collage made by my students, I had once started a studio on Braj. We juxtapose the photographs of the various sites in Braj with paintings, and we find that that way of seeing the landscape that was captured in medieval paintings, that way of seeing is visible, in the way places are made today. So again, in the Braj Mandal Parikrama, and a lot of people do it, especially people from Gujarat, as well as from Bengal. And they go in a circumambulation of all the sites associated with Krishna, starting from Mathura, the birthplace, going through Vrindavan, and going to Gokul, Barsana. And each of these places has its own parikrama. So the Vrindavan parikrama, Vrindavan is actually a small town, and it is like, a little peninsula jutting out into the Yamuna. So large part of that parikrama occurs along the Yamuna. Again, the Vrindavan parikrama is not a circle, but it's the idea that you come back to the point where you had begun from, and the larger Braj Mandal has many other mandals, embedded in it. So I think something here is going on, which can be seen as a principle of self-similarity. So just as we think that the mandal is or Hindus think that the mandal is a microcosm of cosmos. So so it distills all the energies of the cosmos. Similarly, if the Braj Mandal, spanning over 3 states, Haryana, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh, the Braj Mandal itself is duplicated into smaller mandals. Okay. So this map shows the parikrama mark and the places. Now these places, David Haberman and Indiana University has written a very interesting book called 12 Forests. Braj, the forest journey through, something like, that's the name. And really, the parikrama is from grove to grove. Vrindavan in the beginning was really like a grove of, of tulsi shrubs. So we know that Braj is really associated with a pastoral landscape, right? And even though Mathura, is a congested city, and so is Vrindavan, and some of these other places also, like they're heavily built up. But the idea was, that this is a pastoral landscape, and this is Krishna land, right? And so the parikrama is, affirming again the presence of Krishna through direct encounters, if you were ever so lucky, to see him and Radha dancing in the groves. I want to focus on actually one mandal here, and that is of Govardhan. Govardhan, everybody knows Govardhan, no? Yes, yes. So this painting is kind of strange. It's a little unusual painting. So here's Krishna holding up Govardhan on his on his pink, on his index finger. But why are the Brajvasis are supposed to collect under under the parvat, right? But they're walking away. So I could never really figure out what's happening over here. But in painting after painting, we see Govardhan as a mountain, right? As a conical mountain, as an umbrella. Maybe. So it's really, really quite interesting. So when I was there in 2012, along with my students, we found the Govardhan to be just a ridge, and that too not more than 100 feet above us. It's a long ridge, and we found that pilgrims are going around it, and usually it takes them, anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. And there are a number of kunds, water bodies. The main arrival point is, the Mansi Ganga, and there is, a myth associated with each kund. So these become like resting places. And so the Govardhan is considered to be incarnate of Shiva, of Krishna himself, and even each boulder, is form. So it's called Giriraj here. And yes, what was so interesting really was the large number of water bodies. But where were the water bodies located? So this map, actually, the map above, the map below was done by one of my students. The map above shows little green, green things, green icons. So each kund was located in a grove, okay. And again, the sites were associated, with Ras Leela. In fact, the Govardhan kind of disappears in the northern part, like this part. It's not even there, but it's imagined. It's a question of, it's an imagined landscape. So it doesn't really matter whether you see it or not. You're going to go around it anyways. And some of these water bodies are quite spectacular, like Mansi Ganga or Kusum Sarovar, where the structures were built by Dig rulers in the 18th century. And pilgrim circulation is now increasingly happening in the car, on the van, in the bus. The same case in Kashi also. Between 1985 and 2015, Rana P.B. Singh actually calculated the number, got the data from somewhere. Pilgrims have increased, from 48,000 to 68,000, but now I think only 40% are walking and 60% are driving. But you would still see, full prostrations. And this was this was kind of interesting to us because it's a tar road now. Uh, at the foot of hill would have been sand or sandy soil, what is called as Braj Raj. Anyone has done the Govardhan Parikrama or Braj Parikrama? You have. Okay, so you must have seen, the Dandoti Parikrama. So these ladies from Gujarat are using actually a mattress to walk, and then the holy man at the base has 108 stones, and he will prostrate himself, stand up, put the stone aside, and he'll do 108 prostrations before he advances to the next stage of parikrama. Anyway, we thought that was really important that that parikrama take place at the base of Govardhan Hill, and that the ambience of the tank in the grove we maintained. So we had a whole lot of suggestions on towards that. Let's see. We were in Dwarka just a couple of weeks ago, right? And how many of you actually managed to see Okha Mandal? I think a few of you did, right? So again, here the same concept, a mandal, which is an island. It's not actually an island, it's really a peninsula. And what is happening here? How is the eruption of the sacred occurring? Is it the descent? Is it, the shaft of light, the Jyotirlinga? Yes, there is one Jyotirlinga. It's in Nageshwar. But again, this is, Krishna land because of Dwarka. And there is Gopi Talao, where the Ras would have taken place. And then there is Dwarka, which was the capital. It kind of vies with Bet Dwarka on that. So now Mahabharat describes places. I think this is probably one of the earliest compilation of pilgrim sites across the subcontinent. And I guess in your course, you really would ask yourself, what is the knowledge base here? So I think here the knowledge base is that of Mahatmyas of a place, and it's in the Purans. For instance, Varanasi, we have the Kashi Khand, composed around 13th and 14th century, and Skand Puran has all the the collection of the sacred sites. So whether you see it as mere compilation of places and compilation of rituals, or you see it as kind of an understanding of history of geography, shall we say? Michelle, what would you say a Puran is in terms of knowledge system? It's an encyclopedia. Okay. So what is left out in the encyclopedia? I think something is left out for us to not think of it as a knowledge base. I think what is tacit here is that the understanding of what makes a placemaking. So there is a certain vision of the world, a certain image of the world, and there is a certain place vocabulary, as I said, the combination of grove and tank and a vernacular landscape language, and this is knowledge really. It's a knowledge of how to build, how to convert a wilderness into a habitable area. So the mythic Mandal had 7 islands. And Swan Tirtha was where the Dwarkadish temple is located. And it's easy to imagine this as 7 island, a peninsula of 7 islands, or an island composed of 7 islands. For those of you who've been there, know how low lying the land is, and how easy. There are many, low-lying basins, and I imagine in monsoons, some part of Okamandal is covered with water, right? And you see pilgrims everywhere, again, affirming through their body, through their movement, that this is a kshetra, this is a mandal. They probably, they again take the bath, in the kund, which is no longer functional, in front of the Dwarkadish temple, taking in the Gomati, and then they are walking, and increasingly they're taking the bus. And what makes Dwarka so interesting for our class is that we can see myth imprinted on the landscape, a landscape of story of of Krishna, but we also have begun to understand as a palimpsest of archaeological discoveries on the ocean bed and excavated, below the monuments and in the land. And so another former student of mine, Hina Gajjar, proposes a eco-cultural heritage trail. She says, the parikrama is a cultural practice. It's a spatial practice, a cultural practice. But it can also be seen as it can also be an ecological practice, in the sense that if you think about Krishna consciousness, Krishna being anywhere and everywhere, and we think of nature as a vision of Krishna, a pantheistic vision, just as Govardhan was, Krishna told his followers who were worshipping Indra and said, do not worship Indra, the sky god. Worship Govardhan, because Govardhan brings you water. Govardhan brings, you grass for your cattle. And it's true that in Dwarka, he establishes this golden, capital, and he's no longer, the pastoral cow, the cow herder of Braj. But Krishna consciousness, if you just don't think in Swami Prabhupananda's terms or in the ISKCON terms, Krishna consciousness, we see apart from that, is really about being respectful of nature and venerating nature. So she's encouraging, Hina Gajjar in this map is actually extending the Okha Mandal Parikrama to Okha, which is Madi, which is at the base of the peninsula. And she's suggesting a series of vignettes along the way, which can familiarize people, bring them to places, not only to the holy places, but also places which can be new centers of energy. So we saw solar farms and we saw windmills, and so I think, should think nature not only in symbolic terms, but also in terms of utilitarian terms here. And so an eco-cultural heritage trail is really a trail, a pilgrimage of worshipping Krishna, but also venerating nature. This is my last example, and I'll finish this quickly. This is Orcha in Madhya Pradesh. How many of you are familiar with Orcha? Okay. And what do you think of Orcha? Do you think of it as a pilgrim town or as a place to see forts and monuments. Yes. Hmm. Yes, yes. So his historic place, and it seems like his history begins in the 16th century, with Rudra Pratap Singh's foundation, making this, um, the fort, one of the few Jal Durgs we have on the banks of the river Betwa. But then Ram is the real lord of Ayodhya, and he's residing, in the Ram Raj temple, which he was brought from Ayodhya by one of the queens. Now, Ursha is not really considered to be a mandal in quite the same way as Braj Mandal or Kashi Mandal or Ukha Mandal. Uh, I think it has got more tourists and more probably tourists than pilgrims. So even though the number of pilgrims is quite large, and many of these tourists have come from abroad, from Europe, especially, it's got a power of the place. You'd agree with me, all of you who have been there and spent some time there. Now, where does this power lie? Does it lie in the river, river Betwa, which is like, kind of surging river, it's like young, vigorous, river? Does the power lie in the beautiful monuments made, like the Jahangir Mahal, constructed to welcome Jahangir? Is it in Bundela architecture? Is it in Bundela art and frescoes inside the palaces? Or is it simply, in the temples? There are many of them. So what I'm proposing here is that the power of this place really resides in the landscape, and I'll tell you why that is the case. So when we mapped out Orcha, what we found where this is undulating land, basalt, Deccan basalt, and there are a lot of promontories. And so buildings are built at different levels. Okay, it's not the individual buildings, not the individual palaces or temples, but it's the entire ensemble which is, I think, creating the strong sense of place here. And what we saw were that that these temples and palaces were located very, very deliberately at the points at which they were built. So the highest points, we have the most prominent temples, lesser known temples, 5 meters below. And then 5 meters below, on the banks of the Betwa, are the Chhatris. These are the cenotaphs of the Bundela rulers. I'll show them in a minute. And a student of mine, Ana Valderrama, from Argentina, this was her first visit to India. She had never been here. She had no knowledge of, mythology or history. She became very interested in the layout of the small town. And she started connecting places. And what she sees, and this is her way of seeing, and she made us also see the landscape in that way, are that there are invisible circles and triangles. Mind you, these are not streets. Okay, there is no formal structure that follows the triangle or the circle. It is again in the mind's eye. It's imagined. So if you are in the palace, Raja Palace or the Jahangir Palace close by, and then you look out, your gaze will take the gaze will be focused at Lakshmi Narayan temple. Okay. So, and then from Lakshmi Narayan temple and from Raja Mahal, you can see the cenotaphs, the chhatris. Okay. Same if you are at the Ram Raja temple. So here is another, these are two isosceles triangles. The entrance gate linked to Lakshmi Narayan temple, linked to Raja Mahal, describes yet another triangle. And mind you, there is nothing obstructing your vision. Even though these are virtual triangles, they are there. These are visual axes. And the circles drawn, again, are this outer circle actually is the old city wall. Only half of it remains because, half of it was built because the Betwa is on the other side. And again, there is an attempt to link what the terrestrial structures with the with the heavenly realm. So, in the location of the temples, very strong. There is always a very strong drive to make sure that they're located not only to the faces east, but also when the sun is on the Tropic of Cancer. And so that is what Lakshmi Narayan temple, you see the sun rises and the first rays of the sun will enter the temple. Similarly, the sun sets behind the cenotaphs, which are like memorial structures. And again, this orientation, to carry this line of thinking, orientation is very important. East, west, north, south. And I think that is how the square comes into being, right? Where you take the cardinal directions so we have the cardinal directions, but then we also have the intermediate directions. So it's not surprising that the Jal Durg would be built to have the palaces and the temples in line, east-west axis, but also connecting the north and south should be again, a cardinal axis, but it is not, and that is because of the natural topography. So the whole island, it's actually not an island, but it was made an island because there is a fort. This is a fort, and there is a moat. The waters of the river Betwa are coming, into the town. So this whole island is kind of tilted 12 degrees east of the true north. And so many of the structures in the northern part of the island, which are a mimesis, or duplication of the sites of Ramayana, the Sangam, for example, is here. There is Chitrakoot, there's Panchvati, and these are celebrated in the form of small temples and yagshalas. And they are located, like in a kind of a wilderness area. But the built-up area is in the center. And here, you see the Chaturbhuj temple framed in the openings. And yes, the architecture is very interesting. Raja Mahal, the Ram Raja temple, which is a site of live worship, so it doesn't really look historic. It's been painted over many times, Lakshmi Narayan temple. And in Raja Mahal, curiously, so I had gone back, after the workshop, and I just, wanted to tell the local administration, that we had done this, master plan of Orsha. So next morning after the presentation, I go to Raja Mahal, and I see this very strange diagram on the floor, on the stone floor, and nobody could tell me what exactly it is. They said it's a yantra, but I think it can be interpreted. If we can just find the right people to help us. So there are conventions that we are not quite sure of, even though they might, even though we have the Vaastu Shastras and Shilp Shastras, of which we'll talk tomorrow, um, but these diagrams have not been decoded. But these were actually a practical guide to building the Jal Durg, the water fort, I think. And so here the pilgrims are bathing in the Betwa, and they are circumambulating. But now, the circumambulation is not really, they are, from Rajaram temple, starting from Betwa, going to Rajaram temple, going to Lakshmi Narayan temple, going to then the northern part where the Ramayan sites are located, and coming back. So again, it is not a perfect circle. But I think the idea of coming back to the same point of marking a sacred territory in the form, in a circular pattern remains. So here we say, oh, but there are so many tourists, they should have heritage trails and so on and so forth. But why not have the pilgrim trails and heritage trails connected to each other, so that, again, we can learn, the tourist can learn a little bit about mythology, and the pilgrim can learn a little bit about history, the precise times and of, events, battles, and so on. And I leave you with this. It's very important that we understand this knowledge base, which was operating, up to 17th century or even later in building capitals. Because you'll agree with me, those of you who have been to Orcha, that this is a very, very aesthetically powerful place. And this is, not the presence of Ramlala alone. I think there is an aesthetics here that comes about because of the placement of buildings and the creation of a landscape which is structured in terms of its visual axes. So here is, a management plan in which you could say, okay, these visual axes should remain unobstructed for posterity.